Chapter 12 of The Initiate, Some Impressions of a Great Soul by Cyril Scott. The title of this chapter is called The Strange Alteration in Justin Morward Hague. I will have you guys know that this chapter makes me laugh just a little bit. Just a warning, and yes. The utter unconventionality of Justin Morward Hague's spiritually educational methods never struck me very forcibly until an acquaintanceship was contracted with which demonstrated to what lengths this remarkable man would go, contrary to his own refined personality, in order to bring about certain results in students of a particular temperament. There was one disciple I met at his house, for disciple I may rightly call him, who can best be described by that slangy but expressive substantive, a sissy, and who, although I afterwards learned possessed some high qualities of heart, yet on the surface appeared, as the nursery phrase has it, quite unable to say boo to a goose. He seemed to be one of those ultra-feminine souls who have had the misfortune to be born in a man's body, which the necessity for wearing much abominable trousers when he would greatly have preferred to wear skirts instead. Also, there was an air about him which suggested the probability that he was, if not too pure to live at all, at any rate too pure to live long. Nor, as I came to know, was his femininity confined solely to his outward general mien, but showed itself also, in fact, for instance, that he not only sewed on his own buttons, but also those of a young man with whom he shared rooms. In a word, if, as Morward correctly said, he possessed qualities of heart, they were those of an unusually kind old maid, who performed such things as she could for those who she cared about, fussing around them, warming their slippers, and doing 1,000 trifling services of a similar nature, called in one encompassing term, motherliness. For, be it remembered, old maids often possess more of this element than many a mother in the most accurate sense of the word. Tony Bland, both the nickname and surname were particularly suitable. Tony Bland was quite consistent with old maidishness, small of body and small of bone, also somewhat dried up for his 35 years. Neatness, precision, and softness of speech, as may readily be imagined, were furthermore the concomitants of his already mentioned characteristics. As to his admiration for Morward, I must confess that just in this one instant it struck me as difficult to account for, since the latter was an utterly changed being when in his company. Indeed, it was only necessary for Bland to put in an appearance, and all the more obvious signs of spirituality, gentleness, and suavity immediately disappeared for something of an entirely contrary nature. His manner of speaking became hard and shrill, his laugh unpleasantly loud and even vulgar, his conversation interspersed with swear words and bold expressions, and his manners, usually so courteous and picturesquely ceremonious, almost boorish in their nonchalance, that the little old maid-like frame of Tony Bland spent most of its time wincing, as its susceptibilities got repeatedly trodden upon. I had no difficulty in perceiving, but I also perceived as time went on, that attempts were made to render it less obvious. Tony Bland began to be a little ashamed of his sensitivities, and took some steps to hide it. As for myself, the first time I encountered this startling alteration in Morward Hague, I was, of course, taken very considerably aback, though my surprise was later on to be transformed into heightened admiration, the policy, therefore, being explained to my entire satisfaction. It was as the result of my many chance calls on Morward that I met Tony Bland. He was primly seated, with hands folded, on the edge of a chair, while his companion stood with his back to the fire, his thumbs inserted in the armholes of his waistcoat, and, quite contrary to his usual custom, smoking a very large cigar, from which the room was rendered unpleasantly thick with fumes. Without deigning to move, he nodded to me as I entered, and a rather loud and bounderish manner introduced us. "Hello," I said. Since when have you taken to smoking cigars? He laughed loudly. Smoking, my dear fellow, is a vice of mine which I need to use on some of my hypersensitive students as a medicine for their spiritual welfare. After which cryptic remark he added, Bland has some views on this subject, haven't you, Antonia? But in answer to this, as might be expected, Bland only smiled, looked embarrassed, and gently rubbed his hands. Well, aren't you going to expound them? Urged Morward. I only think perhaps it is a pity to, it strikes me as rather an unpleasant habit, especially when indulged in to excess. You see, he pursued hesitatingly and turned to me, Justin smokes all day long, and that really can't be good. This was news to me, and I probably showed it, but Morward offered no explanation. Come, he said. You're hedging. You're not truthful enough to say that you think all people who smoke like chimneys are beasts, especially cigar smokers. You need not be afraid to speak out. Broadbent, have a cigar. I cast a glance at Bland, hesitating whether to accept under the circumstances, but Morward gave me a look which undoubtedly showed he did not wish me to refuse. So I took one. That's it. Now then, Antonia, what were we talking about? He said. The various forms of yoga, said Bland in a contrastingly mild tone of voice. Yogu, shouted Morward. Yogu! Yoga! Yoga! Yoga. Let's start that over. The various forms of yoga, said Bland in a contrastingly mild tone of voice. Yog, shouted Morward good-humoredly. Didn't I tell you the A was silent and the word pronounced like yog? But it sounds so much prettier with the A, lisped Tony. Prettier be damned, said Morward. Cholmondeley sounds prettier, as you call it, than chumley. But all the same, the latter is correct. However, have it as you wish, in northern India it is called yog, and in southern yoga. Call it by the latter, and for reasons I needn't go into, certain people will consider you an ignoramus. Haven't I seen the name paraded by sandwich men up and down Regent Street? I asked. Very likely, returned Morward. Professional palmists, clairvoyants, and people of that ilk are found of defiling the sublimest science in the world by associating it with their low-down vocations. There's a little note here at the bottom of the page. It says, note, yoga is the science, yogi is the practitioner. Okay. Very likely, returned Morward. Professional palmists, clairvoyants, and people of that ilk are fond of defiling the sublimest science in the world by associating it with their low-down vocations. But what about those in India who smear themselves with ashes and do all sorts of queer tricks? Queried Bland tentatively. No great yogi ever parades his attainments before the world, said Morward. On the contrary, the greater the man, the more ordinary does he try to appear to the uninitiated. It is only people of very moderate sanctity, like some of your parsons, who affect an unctuous voice and wear mourning, as if to say, I'd have you know I am a good man, and that in spite of the biblical injunctions against any outward show of piety. There are, in fact, two forms of hypocrisy, if we can use the word at all. The hypocrisy of the great man who pretends he is ordinary, and the hypocrisy of the ordinary man who pretends he is great. They are both deceivers, if you like, but one is the deception of modesty and high ethics, and the other of vanity. So the yogis you refer to, my Antonia, are not worthy examples of yog any more than the pale young curate is a worthy example of true Christian spirituality. All the same, I've known some delightful curates, mused Bland, most inaudibly. Morward burst into laughter and asked how many slippers he had embroidered for them. As for me, I felt more and more that if Tony was a milksop addicted to utterly obvious and old-maidish remarks, Morward spared no pains to make him appear ridiculous, a procedure quite contrary to any I had ever witnessed on his part hitherto. And yet the reason for it all never dawned on me at the time, though I dimly sensed there must be one, and what is more, that very reason and a discourse on yoga are my excuse for writing about Tony Bland at all, since he offers no episode of special interest, but was merely a type calling for treatment, as already said, of a very unusual nature. He had merely responded to Morward's last bit of chaff, by a slightly embarrassed and non-committal giggle. And personally, I opined he was quite capable of spending a large part of his time in embroidering slippers for curates, although no doubt I did him an injustice. In fact, he offended me, this mincing little man, and I felt disposed to give him a rousing smack on the back and shake him into some semblance of masculinity. Morward, however, made a remark which rendered me painfully aware that my reflections and inclinations were not exactly of the most charitable order. "Run a man down," he said, "and Antonio will stick up for him. Outward appearances, my dear Broadbent, are deceptive, though the statement is damned trite. Do you take that in?" he added, turning to Bland. "No, you don't, and there's no trouble." He began to stride about the room, his left thumb still inserted in the armhole of his waistcoat. "Yes," he repeated, "that's just the trouble. The silly notion that spirituality and formality and milksopishness can ever be coincident. Don't you realize that the goal of mankind is God consciousness, cosmic consciousness, and yet can anyone suppose for a moment that the consciousness of a pale young curate or an old maid can in any way resemble the consciousness of deity? Guts, my dear fellow, are the first things necessary to arrive at God consciousness." Tony blinked, smiled genteelly, and refolded his hands. "I can't quite see how, what is it? Reversing the peristaltic action of the digestion, as the yogis do, can tend to union with God?" he mused audibly. "Can't you? Well, I'll tell you this much," said Morward with a certain good-humored aggressiveness, "that anything remarkable that anybody can do is a step Godward and a step towards freedom. Impotence is the strongest of all fetters. Talk about being like God, who projected this universe from himself and yet be incapable of doing anything but twirl the thumbs. Bless my soul, what a conception! Besides, I'll tell you another thing. It is mighty difficult to have God consciousness if you've got a rotten body. Perfect health is not only essential to this highest state of bliss, but it is also an attribute of God. Just imagine God ill, God miserable, God in tears," he laughed. "And as to these yogis whom you disapprove of because you know nothing about them, I tell you their science in itself is the highest thing on earth. There is hardly a miracle, so-called, that these yogis cannot learn to perform. But just because they won't come to London and give a show in St. James' Hall, people won't believe it. Although they are quite ready to believe that the great yogi of Nazareth performed miracles some 2,000 years ago. Oh, I grant you that some of these lower-grade yogis perform hair-raising feats out there in India before a wondering public. But the type who uses his powers either to gratify his vanity or to obtain money never gets any further. Acquisitiveness and vanity very soon block the way to further consciousness." He sat down in his armchair and put his feet on the mantelpiece after throwing away his cigar and lighting another. "But I'll tell you a deuced valuable asset that yoga possesses," he continued. Its states of consciousness are arrived at through physiological methods, and not through hypnotic ones, nor through the agency of drugs. And what does that imply? Why, that nobody can pretend with the assurance of ignorance that imagination plays any part in the matter. In order to hypnotize yourself, you have to dwell on some idea or image until you imagine you actually see the thing you are thinking about. But yoga is quite different from this. Inside the body are certain latent forces. Wake these up through purely physiological processes known to yogis, and you alter your entire consciousness. Begin to see things, hear things, and perceive things that are around you, but of which you were hitherto quite unaware. And can anybody practice yoga? I asked. If you can find a teacher, which I admit is not easy. I suppose it means going to India? I inferred. He laughed. Yoga is to be found in all countries if you know where to look, was his reply. It has been in England for over 300 years, and there are adepts in London now. It is all very interesting, observed Tony, as he got up from his chair, but I am afraid I must be going. Oh, no, that's Tony said that. But I am afraid I must be going. Time to be off, eh? Said Morward without rising. Well, so long, Antonia. Let me know when you're coming again. He shook hands from his seat by the fire and then chucked away his cigar. Tony bade me goodbye with the remark that he hoped he would meet me again soon, and took a prim departure. What does all this mean? I said when I knew. What does all this mean? I said when I knew by the closing of the front door that Bland was out of hearing. Morward took down his feet from the mantelpiece and indulged in one of his ordinary genial peals of laughter. First of all, he said, getting up and going to open the window, we'll let some of the smoke out. I fear it has rather inconvenienced you. And now I'll tell you exactly what it does mean, although I would have thought you'd have guessed already. He was utterly himself again. His voice had resumed its normal tone, his manner once again taken on that picturesque slight ceremoniousness which was one of his so pleasant characteristics. You didn't know I was something of an actor? He questioned. I admitted that the thought had not struck me. And yet there are some people, he went on, towards whom it is essential to adopt a certain manner which shall counteract their misconceptions on the one hand and brace them up on the other. Tony, as you observed, is too lady. Okay, I want to start that over. And yet there are some people, he went on, towards whom it is essential to adopt a certain manner which shall counteract their misconceptions on the one hand and brace them up on the other. Tony, as you observed, is too ladylike. He lacks power. That is already a stumbling block in his path of itself. But a worse one is the supposition that the prerequisite to spirituality and this primness and this quintessence of propriety, in other words, the least thing, shocks him. Well, the only way to counteract this is to harden him, to make a man of him by offending his sensibilities to such an extent that they eventually become annihilated. You've heard of the hardening system in therapeutics. Well, some people need the hardening system in spiritual therapeutics. There is no other way. Certainly the wisdom of this struck me as undeniable. All the same, I wondered whether in this case any good would accrue. Tony Bland, as I saw him, seemed to me a person one can alone describe as hopeless. In fact, I couldn't resist expressing my views to Morward. There is one thing puzzles me about you sometimes, I said, and that is the amazing amount of trouble you take with, I don't want to be intolerant, but I call them utterly stupid people. You do Tony an injustice, was his reply. He is deplorably shy before strangers, but he is far from stupid fundamentally. He has plenty to say when nobody else is present. Let him once get to know you, and he will not favor you with any more trite remarks. I grant you he is a very feminine soul and has much to contend against, but if you had 4 or 5 previous incarnations as a woman, as he has had, you'd be pretty much the same as he is. His destiny is a difficult one. But there are others, I reminded him, as ordinary as he and more hopeless, and yet you have taken what would seem to be endless trouble over them. You have not yet accustomed yourself to think in eternities, he replied, smiling. I have known each of those people in the past, and each of them has done me some service. Well, ingratitude ought hardly to be one of our vices, so I can but desire to repay them. Do you think Tony, for instance, would put up with my boorish ways if there had been no previous association to draw us together? Time after time, Tony comes here for what he honors me by calling my wisdom and knowledge of occult subjects, and puts up with the slang and the swear words because, in spite of them, well, he believes in me and is subconsciously aware we have been together before. So you see, my friend, an enlarged memory alters the perspective of things, and the apparently meaningless becomes full of meaning. Tony has fine qualities of soul perceptible to those who know him, but even if he had not, I would still make the attempt to further his spiritual happiness as a grateful repayment of that old service rendered. And if he were not ripe for the path in this incarnation, I would try again in his next, for affection will always draw us together again, life after life. I never saw Tony Bland again, but that one meeting with him showed me indirectly more and more the grandeur of a life which dealt with thousands of years instead of the short span of 70 years and 10. Certainly, there was, in Moreward's remarkable philosophy, no waste, no meaninglessness of the smallest emotion or action, apparently. Through his example and tuition, life became something infinitely grand. All sense of futility vanished forever, and even such a thing as the use of a swear word in his philosophy had, in its ridiculousness, a flavor of the sublime.